I have a question. Based on the readings today and last Sunday's gospel, and a few gospels yet to come, because John's gospel is woven into the last few weeks, are we hungry enough? More than once, you'll hear, I am the bread of life from Jesus. Are we hungry enough for that bread? Last week, I referred to other hungers that people have that are on a scale superficial. Their own hungers for power, for prestige, and other misguided hungers. Because it's part of the human nature to want more, to go after what we hunger for. Now, the simplest hunger is food. And Jesus is saying that he is the food of life, the bread of life. That sort of touches the significance of hunger, because you eat bread, you finish, tomorrow you're hungry again. So he's not talking about bread made at the bakery. He refers to the manna in the desert that his ancestors ate when they came across the desert under the guidance of Moses. That was temporary from the scales of the tamarisk trees. And they found the manna on the desert floor. And they said, what is this? That's where the word manna comes from. What is this? And those ancestors of Jesus and you and me ate the manna, were filled, and kept their journey going. So Jesus is saying that the manna that they ate is not the manna I'm going to give you. The manna Jesus, has given us is deeper. It's more universal to our whole bodies, and it's more significant. Anyone who wants something in life, doesn't matter what it is right now, you know what the longing is for that thing. Whether it's a person, a relationship, a possession, doesn't matter. If you're longing for it, we know what we're talking about now, because Jesus is going there to the depths of our longing, the depths of our hunger for whatever we want. If you're political, you want a position in politics. If you're religious, you want a position in the church. If you're a mom or dad, you want a position of appropriate behavior at home, and the list goes on. But the hunger that Jesus is talking about supersedes any of those. It's touched upon, you might say, with the reading from Paul to the Ephesians, sort of backwards. He's saying, avoid bitterness, angry, fury, reviling, and shouting. We know that goes on, maybe in our lives, in our homes, in our city. That's a very superficial hunger. When I'm angry at somebody and I get even with them and I tell them how I feel about them or their attitude or their behavior, that's satisfying a very superficial hunger of revenge inside of me. The hunger for Jesus goes deeper, and I guess we can go back to Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and he says, I want you to be compassionate as God is compassionate. These are my words, this is the hunger he advises. Compassion and forgiveness. That hunger for compassion and forgiveness goes deeper. And when you've forgiven when we've forgiven somebody, there's a satisfaction and a reward that goes with that satisfies us, that, quote, makes us feel good. That's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because we're trying to imitate Christ. Compassion. You give compassion to someone and they show it. They show their reaction. That's satisfying a great hunger in them and in us, because we're people. When people give compassion to another person, I don't care what his or her position is, we're elevating ourselves to the presence of God. And we're imitating Jesus, and we're being filled. That hunger for reverence of life is being filled in us as we do it. And go back to my original question, do we hunger enough? Are we bringing enough of God's word and life into the world? Because we have to hunger for it first to bring it into the world, to activate it. And every family has our own list of hungers. And we can answer the hungers of ourselves if we imitate Jesus, if we bring him into our lives. Now, the reason the first reading is here from Elijah, from the prophet, book of Kings, is because Elijah was hungering for something, justice, and this shows you you're not always rewarded for doing good. You're hungry for doing justice, you're not necessarily going to be rewarded. You may feel satisfied, but the story with Elijah is about in the book of Kings. In the beginning of the book of Kings, we're told the book of Kings is not a book of accomplishments of the kings of Israel. The book of Kings is a list of all their poor leadership. So it's sort of a sarcastic book, but it shows the rise of the prophets that we all know, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, through the centuries, because the prophets rose up and spoke God's word because the kings who were supposed to be the leaders of the community didn't do it. And today we have Ahab. Many of you know the name Jezebel. And if I say Jezebel, most of us have a negative reaction to her, whether we know who she was or not. And we call someone a Jezebel, but we're not complimenting them. Jezebel was a pagan woman that Ahab marries. The king of Israel marries a pagan. Disgrace number one. The king of Israel allowed Jezebel to set up fortune tellers, false prophets, pagan gods in the temple. Mistake number two. So notice the hunger issue here. Abram is the king. He's hungering for power. He's hungering for acceptance from Jezebel. So it shows we can be hungry for false ideas as well. We see that in our world very clearly. Front page of any newspaper, any Twitter feed, any Facebook. Hunger for what is powerful, hunger for what is warlike, hunger for what is revenge, and the list goes on. So hunger isn't always for something good, it's for something within us that we really want to satisfy. That's why we as Christians focus on Jesus, to be hungry for compassion, to be hungry for justice. So what happens with, go back to Jezebel, the prophet Elijah comes on the scene and tells the king where to go, basically, and tells the king that what you're doing is disgraceful and it's disgracing God. So he's speaking as a prophet. So Jezebel challenges him. She said, let's see whose God is real. Let's see whose God is in charge. So they set a fire. They're going to offer sacrifice to God. Jezebel gets her 400 priests, and they dance and they sing and they arrange the fire, and nothing happens. Elijah calls upon God, and God not only sends fire onto the altar, destroys the altar, destroys the false prophets and Jezebel's priests. Where this reading picks up today is he's running. He's running away, Elijah. He's running for his life. He was hungering for God's work, for God's word, for God's deeds. And now what we see is him not being rewarded for that goodness of heart and deed. In psychology, we call that penalized success. He's being penalized because he succeeded in doing good. Anybody who's in the world knows what that means. We're not always rewarded for doing God's word and doing God's work. So he's running away, and he got so bad, again, we heard it very clearly read, he was so disappointed and so sad that he did good and he's not getting a reward. And Jezebel and her soldiers are after him. So he falls asleep under a tree. And here's a piece that we can identify with. Things got so bad that he tells God, let me die. He wanted suicide. He wanted to escape all the horror that's going on around him. There are people in our world, our families and friends, who sometimes get so hurt, so disappointed, and so depressed, they pray for that. They pray for suicide. They pray to die. God is the answer. God sends an angel to him to feed him, to give him something to drink, and tell him to go his way. He sends him to Mount Horeb. I don't know if it's another mountain. In other words, Sinai, where the Ten Commandments were given. He seeks shelter there, and there in his quiet prayer finds God. God speaks to him in a whisper. Again, we're going back to the hunger that this Elijah, this prophet, had for God. And how, even though, now we can identify with him, even though we might hunger for what is good, what is right, what is just, what is correct, we're not always going to be rewarded with it. And we're not going to always be rewarded by society because of it. But God is on our side. The bread of life is with us eternally. We come here to be nourished on the bread of life. We're taking God into our lives, into our families, into our world, and he will never abandon us. The world might, but he will never abandon us. Jesus says, I am the bread of life who comes down from heaven, and he who eats this bread will live forever. As Elijah lives forever, and we who are invited to eat the Eucharist will live forever, even though the world won't always accept us. Hunger for Jesus.